This is Atari, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
One day I call up there, and I don't get a hold of him. Instead, I get a hold of his mother. And I was like, "Yes, ma'am. May I please speak with Robert?" And she was like, "Who are you?" I was like, "I'm a friend of Robert." She said, "Are you one of those computer pirates?" You know, these computer pirates are getting Robert in trouble, and he's only 16 years old. He doesn't need this type of trouble, and blah, 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 screaming at me. They were accusing him of having robbed more than $150,000 worth of phone services. Tell you what we're going to do. I want you to put your disc collection in one big box, and it better be everything. And I'm going to be by your house in 15 minutes to pick up that box.
Hey, I'm Kevin Sevitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. Gary Walton owned Discount Video and Computers, a large Atari dealership in Fort Pierce, Florida, and was involved in the Atari software piracy scene. Gary is one of the people who helped me find Glenn, the 5200 man, whom I previously interviewed and whom we talk about in this interview. This interview took place on September 12, 2015. The New York Yankees lost both games in its doubleheader with the Toronto Blue Jays that day. This interview contains adult language and content.
Hey, Kev.
Hey.
Let me go grab a chair and we'll talk. Hold on.
Great.
Although you are interrupting my New York Yankees game.
I'm sorry.
Darn right you should be.
They're gonna lose whether or not you watch, so.
Ooh, there's a rather low shot.
Spell your last name for me, Gary.
Okay, I'm going to use an alias, if you don't mind. That'd be Walton.
Walton? Walton?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Why the alias?
Pardon?
Why the alias?
It's something I've been doing for over 40 years.
Okay.
And it has paid off in many different ways.
Okay.
Just one of my idiosyncrasies, if you will.
All right. All right. So, where do we start? How did you get started with Atari? I understand that you had at the time one of the biggest Atari the biggest Atari dealership in Florida. Is that right?
Well, actually, I'd like to clarify that, and that being software-wise, I had more Atari software than virtually anybody else, including, my store was located in sunny Fort Pierce, which is a minimal-sized township, whereas I know for a fact I blew away stores in Fort Lauderdale and Miami.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, I had easily over 1,500, 2,000 pieces of software.
Wow.
Yeah. Of course, there had to be that much software out there, so that was a buildup of many years.
Sure. All right. So, what year did you get? How did you get started? And tell me about the beginning of it when you were like, I'm going to open a software store.
How I got started was I used to be a construction stoop advisor, and making very, very good money. I actually was part of Bonaventure down in Fort Lauderdale. Mm-hmm. And to make a very long story short, I injured my back, which resulted in surgery. I was on workman's comp, and basically workman's comp had me laying around over 6 months, and I started getting fidgety, and ended up just walking in one day to a video/computer store, mm-hmm. and was amazed by what I saw, in so much as the store owner was a smaller shop. The store owner had an Atari 800 set up with it was either Pac-Man or... No, wouldn't have been Pac-Man at that point. It was probably a Scott Adams adventure. Mm-hmm. And I became hooked. It was that simple. Mm. Pretty soon after that, I was working for the guy off the books and renting movies in the VHS days of, relatively early VHS days. And at the same time, took a major interest in the Atari computers. Worked for the guy part-time. Mm-hmm. And worked for him for about 6-8 months, and finally decided I wanted to do the same thing, but I felt I needed to go somewhere that ideally didn't have video and didn't have computers. And the first location north of Fort Lauderdale, because I spent about 4 or 5 months investigating this, the first location that I found that didn't have either a video store or a computer store was Fort Pierce. And at that time, interestingly enough, and it has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but over the course of that 4 or 5 months, every Sunday I was getting the Fort Pierce Sunday paper. And every Sunday, the township, if you will, or just the writers in the paper, were talking about the opening of the seaport in Fort Pierce, making it much bigger and wider to accommodate luxury ships and stuff, and then expanding what they call the international airport, which doesn't even have a terminal, as I came to learn eventually. Bottom line is, here it is 33 years ago. It was 33 years later, and I'm still waiting for the seaport to open up, and I'm still waiting for the international airport to be expanded.
You can't rush these things, you know.
Right.
So what was your store? What was your store called?
Discount Video and Computers.
Mm-hmm.
It was a learning experience, especially the first 2 years. It was the first time I'd done retail.
Sure.
Plus, I had all my personal money sunk into the store to begin with.
Sure.
There were no loans or anything. So I worked it like a dog, literally, for the first few years, 7 days a week. Mm-hmm. Granted, I took a half a day off on Sunday, but even still, it was difficult.
Sure.
But, although I was located in, call bumfrig nowhere of Fort Pierce, fairly quickly I picked up clientele from as much as 50, 100, hell, from other states miles away.
Sure.
Because of my assortment.
What year did the store open?
With a little bit of hesitancy, I'll say 83. I'm not certain, to be honest. I think it was late 83.
Okay. All right. So,
maybe 82. Doesn't matter.
All right. So you sold Atari software and...
Well, I did the hardware as well.
Okay.
Initially, I was purchasing through a distributor.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I never actually purchased through Atari themselves. Never. I could always get better pricing third party. Again, I contribute part of that to the fact that I was buying a ton of software.
Right. Okay, so tell me a story about running the store and selling Atari stuff, and what was it like?
Well, selling the Atari stuff obviously was a lot of fun. I had a setup out in front of the store itself with a computer. Well, heck, I just. It took me a while to get a monitor. I used to have a GE 13-inch TV along with the 810 drive, along with an 800, and eventually hooked up a printer, because I remember when the lowest priced printers you could find were the Centronics 737, and wholesale they were going for, I believe it was like $600.
Yeah.
The Star Geminis, when they popped out, were certainly eye-popping with a retail price on them of $200, and that made life a lot easier to be able to get a printer hooked up.
Sure.
A lot of people, especially in this area, being an agricultural/industrial area, didn't have that type of money. And then, let's see, stories about the shop. I mean, they are endless. Quite frankly, I usually like to have a friend of mine here who experienced the same things, and there's many of them to remind me of the stories.
What brought people into the store? What was like the attraction?
Again, I was the only Atari outpost for easily 50 miles in any direction, if not more, considerably more. And to specialize in Atari the way I did, was even more rare. Mm-hmm. Although at that time, IBM was still just getting off the ground type, or IBM type machines were just getting off the ground.
Right.
I guess one of the biggest things that helped me initially was the fact that I did the home show here in Fort Pierce. That was about 5 months after I opened. And at the home show, I wowed them, if you will. I dragged both a 400 and an 800 out there, one with a cassette drive, the other one with a disc drive, and the local newspaper landed up putting me on the front page. That helped my business tremendously.
So this was like a general home show where...
Yeah, just a localized
convention.
home show. In Fort Pierce, I'd be surprised if they drew 4,000 or 5,000 people. But that's how this town is, rather small.
So what were you showing off back then? At the
right. Oh, the people were amazed. They had never seen anything like that before.
Yeah.
And at that point, I believe we did have Pac-Man, and Pac-Man was the hottest thing going. And, I believe that's exactly what they took a picture of, was me instructing some kid with Pac-Man on the screen. I believe that's how it went. Although knowing me, it might have been something like Dot Gobbler, which was a pirated version of, or a rip-off version of Pac-Man. People wouldn't have known the difference anyway.
Yeah.
From there, it was just, like I say, a tedious road. I mean, the different things that happened, one in particular that comes to mind, I had this guy he's from Okeechobee, which is a township about 50 miles away from Fort Pierce towards the center of Florida. And this guy had come over and, again, saw Pac-Man or something and was mesmerized by it, and he had to have a system. And apparently he had the money. And he had an 800 disk drive, and I guess he hooked it up to a television. I don't remember if I sold him a monitor. But basically he started getting chummy with other people out in Okeechobee. And this guy was, quite frankly, as dumb as a rock. And, matter of fact, it had to be an Excel system that I had sold him, now that I think about it. Because his biggest problem was he couldn't understand that in order to bring up binary, you had to hold down I believe it was the option key or the start key, something like that. And, if you wanted basic, you didn't do anything. You turned on the machine. And apparently, and I remember the program, somebody had pirated him a version of F-15, Strike Eagle. And he couldn't get it to work in his system. And comes into my shop, and just coincidentally at that time, one of the people who used to hang around my shop a lot was a guy who was an ex-Navy SEAL and, quite frankly, was still living as though he were a Navy SEAL. I mean, he would just come into my shop, and he's a nice enough guy. I enjoyed his company and whatnot, but sometimes out of nowhere, he'd go into a karate stance and start doing exercises in the middle of my shop. Granted, he'd have the decency not to do it while somebody was here, usually. And notice I say usually. But he, that's one of the things he would do. Anyway, this guy comes in with this pirated piece of software, and he's like, why won't this work in my machine? And I look at what he's holding, and I said to him, I was like, sir, this is a pirated piece of software. It's not something you bought from me. Because at that time I used to preach to people, you got a problem with a piece of software you got from me, come on back. I'll sit down with you. We'll do whatever we need to do. And he couldn't quite understand that it was a pirated piece of software, and I wasn't going to raise a finger to help him. So he starts getting a little loud with me, and this other guy, the karate dude. All of a sudden, he's standing, 15, 20 feet off to the side, while this guy starts, not yelling at me, but getting, abusive, whatever you want to call it. All of a sudden, Bill, the karate dude, starts going into his karate sequence. Whatever. And I'm, stunned by this. At the same time, the other guy, and I can't remember his name, is like, what, you going to screw with me, motherfucker? I'll kick your ass. And right away, I had to mediate. I stepped in. I was like, guys, please. I don't want any of this. I don't need my software all over the goddamn store. And, they both settled down and whatnot. And quite frankly, nothing ever happened of it. But I just thought it humorous to hear Bill, Mr. Ex-Navy SEAL, and didn't mind telling complete strangers about his life. He's going to defend me over a piece of pirated software. Ignorant shit.
Nice.
But I got to say this, and that being, remember the name I mentioned to you about Jolly Roger?
Yeah.
He was the one, when I got into Atari at the very beginning, and I realize I'm being haphazard here and trying to tell you my story, he was the one that really got me going into the Atari piracy. And in fact, and now I'm talking, again, the very early days, I want to say we were one of the first ones. There was three of us, actually, but Mike, Tony, and myself. We invented a way to be able to back up, in particular, Sierra Online. And it was quite ingenious how we did it. Sierra Online used to make the first few sectors of their disk-based software corrupt on purpose. And what we ended up doing in order to copy this stuff was we used I believe it was Disk Doctor to copy the information, and then we would go back. Well, actually, no. First, we would have to format the disk, blank disk, and we had a tire tool that was actually a magnet on one end. And after formatting the disk, you would go back and physically turning the disk with your hands, you would allow the magnet to sit on top of if I remember correctly, it was the outside of the disk through the hole, and it would erase the format. You would then go ahead and just reformat for a split second. You'd hit the format command, hit enter, allow it to start the format sequence, and quickly pop it out. And then you would go back using Disk Doctor and write the first, and I forget how many it was, 10 sectors, 12 sectors, whatever it was, and then you'd instruct Disk Doctor to jump to where we've already, using Disk Doctor, figured out where the program started.
Right.
And we were able to back up Sierra Online stuff, which at that point all the Atari nerds that we knew, and mind you, this is before I had my store. I'm still living down in Lauderdale.
Right.
Nobody else had a clue. At one point, oh gosh, now what the hell? Mike, myself, and Tony were good friends with the Motorola had a plant right across the street from where I lived. And one of the guys in the Motorola plant was an Atari freak. And he actually formed a club of what I would guess to be about 30 to 40 people over at Motorola that had Atari computers. And it got to the point where Mike and I, at that point, Tony had moved, started selling them software, bootleg software. Everything from word processing to games to, whatever. Because, again, we could back up everything. They couldn't back up shit. And without exaggeration, it was about $1,000 a month we were making off of them. Again, I'm going back to what would be 81 anyway.
Right. This is selling pirated software.
Yeah, which was the only time I ever actually sold pirated software was during that period of time, which lasted. That was when my back was screwed up. So that lasted probably about 6-8 months. Actually, after I moved away, Mike and I continued to do it by me sending things down to him, as well as Mike doing things himself. Mike was the Jolly Roger, did not like any publicity, didn't want his name thrown around on software and such like that, but hands down, he was overall the best pirate, per se.
So you're playing both sides of the field. You're selling software legitimately, and you're pirating software out of the back.
Again, you have to remember, the pirating went on before I opened my store.
Oh, okay. All right.
Two separate entities. Now, when somebody bought a piece of software from me, and I was insisting, keep your receipts. If you have a problem with your software, I'll take care of it.
Yeah.
And what might happen, and did happen on numerous occasions, a year later, the dog ate the disc, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But they could show me that they bought the thing, and I'd make them a backup. No problem. I didn't care what it was.
So seriously, you okay? So aside from making backups, you went legit after you opened the store, and you.
I went legit, but I still did my piracy stuff strictly for myself. was a big, not only an ego thing, but I was so into games, it was ridiculous. I mean, without exaggeration, I know I had to have played 3,000-4,000 games just on the Atari XE type stuff.
Sure.
Everything that came into my shop. Well, understand this, I was buying from CSS back then. Well, a lot of my business was CSS. Every single piece of software that came into the shop for sale, I would open up and look at. Whether I spent 5 minutes on it or 5 weeks, dictated how good I felt the game was, or if my buddies. At that time, I think about it, if you wanted to call the police, you were much better calling Discount Video as opposed to the police station. Because, again, I am not exaggerating. Every day in my shop, 4 to 6 cops just hanging around, mostly playing games, looking at my movies, whatever. And at that time also, I carried some other systems, but nowhere near as much as Atari. Remember the Vectrex?
Sure.
Yeah. I sold the Vectrex, I sold the Intellivision, Coleco, whatever came along. That was a disaster, was the Coleco fiasco.
Why was it a disaster for you?
Well, I had 8 of them pre-sold, and I forget what they were. I think they were $800 a piece when they first popped out. The Coleco Atom, not the Coleco Vision. And I had 8 of them pre-sold. People giving me their deposits, and then I order the things in, and I get them from my distributor. And that day, they were lined up at my door to come pick up their Coleco Atom, Coleco Vision with Atom or whatever it was.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be a computer system. And they all come in, they all give me the rest of their money, they all go home. The following day, I pull up in my shop, there's 8 customers sitting at my front door. I've just pulled in a $4,800 a day just based on those guys, or 64, whatever it was, I don't remember. And here they are all at the shop, and I open up the door, I can't even turn on the lights, and they're coming in carrying their boxes. And everybody was the same thing. If you don't remember, what it was the first releases of the Coleco Atom. They used a tape drive,
right?
And the magnetic field from that tape drive was erasing the tapes themselves. And here I am having to issue out. Obviously, I didn't leave the cash in the shop. I had brought it home,
right.
And I had to issue out a bunch of refunds. And again, these are farmer-type people in many cases.
Right.
They want a check. They want cash. I gave you cash. Give me cash.
Yeah, it was something about if you turned the machine on when there was a tape in the drive, it would erase it or something.
Well, the thing was, in order to get the system to work to begin with, you had to run that tape.
Yeah.
And the first time you stuck it in there and turned on the machine, you were erasing the tape. They could not boot up the machines.
Yeah. Oh, man.
The fact that it was all 8 of them, made me believe in what they were telling me. They just couldn't get the things to work.
Yeah.
And I didn't even have to bother setting one up to figure out what was going on. And in fact, my distributor apparently learned about it as well real quickly. That was a big fiasco. Set back Coleco Vision in the beginning. What else Atari? Let me think Atari here. You're not interested in ColecoVision. No, by the way, I did look at your podcast stories, and I couldn't help but notice that apparently I'm your first pirate you're interviewing.
No, we have not done a lot of pirates, but I've done a couple. I have to find the other name. I did an interview with it was 3 guys at once, and they did a lot of legitimate things and piratey things. And you have to give me a few minutes while we talk to find his name, but no, I have not talked to a lot of pirates.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
I just, I went through if you have 80 of them up there, I'd say I went through about 50 of them. Not reading the entire story, but basically, when you start the podcast, you mention, how they stood with Atari, what their field was.
No, I haven't talked to a lot of pirates, and I'd like to. I want to talk to more. Although I did yesterday. I talked to Glenn yesterday. So
you found Glenn?
Yep, and he talked to me. Yep.
Well, I'm really he maybe changed his ways. Did he mention anything about ghosts?
Nope. No.
No?
No.
Too bad you didn't touch on that perimeter.
I thought it would be safer to stay away from that.
Right, I understand. Again, the way I knew him, you're 100% correct. Wow, interesting that you tracked him down.
But well, it was thanks to you. I once had his last name. It was pretty easy. So.
Oh, really? Listed in the phone book or something?
Facebook and Twitter. So.
Yeah. Okay. I fully understand.
Yeah.
Personally, I'd love to know if he ever got hooked up with a woman.
I didn't ask that either.
If he was married or not. Just like I say, he was very strange. My buddy Steve has not undug his closet at this point anyway. But you don't need it anymore now that I think about it. Although he would have, again, like I told you before, I've forgotten more than I remember. Mm-hmm. Steve was the type that wrote every little thing down. He's such a perfectionist type person. And he would have a lot more information than I will off the top of my head.
Yeah, well, always having access to, actual records of things is pretty, not.
Oh yeah, that would be overpowering for you.
Yeah, because memories are one thing, but like having actual notes from back in the day.
That's how he was. He ran what was called the Legion of Doom bulletin board, mm-hmm. and it was a level-based bulletin board. And again, if you didn't donate, depending on what you donated, dictated how far up the ladder you went. Mm-hmm. And not too many people had high access. They may have thought they did, but they didn't understand. He was such a perfectionist running his bulletin board, and what's funny was he was, 10, 12 years younger than me. And to this day, I can remember talking to him on the phone about something. And he always used to complain about his mother. He said he wasn't allowed to walk on the carpet. He had to float over it his entire life. And, I'd be discussing something with him on the phone in the background. Steve, clean up your room. Steve, vacuum this. Steve, go tend to the horses. Whatever it was. It was always something. It was just funny listening to that. Here's another good story for it. Did I tell you about Robert Yeager?
No,
the pinhead? Montezuma's Revenge?
Tell me.
Okay. Forget how I landed up contacting him initially, but I did the preliminary contact. The kid's name was Robert Yeager. At this point, he had written Pinwheel, and I failed to remember who he had written it for.
Pinhead.
Yes, correct. I'm sorry, Pinhead, yeah. And for some reason, I contacted him, got into a long discussion with him, and made a deal with him that I was going to make up 10 double-sided discs of nothing but various files, cartridges, whatever, that were all files. And in return, he would send me, 10 or 12 copies of his new game, Montezuma's Revenge, which I had seen because I had pirated it already, but it had not been released. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in pirating Montezuma's Revenge, if I remember correctly, there were 3 different versions, which was even more surprising. Anyway, I make this deal that I'm going to send him this stuff, and I make it up the next day, ship it out to him. He was somewhere up north, Massachusetts, Connecticut, somewhere. And I wait about a month, and in the course of that month, I don't hear anything. He's got my phone number, he can call me, and I don't really want to bother him. I really don't know who I'm dealing with. This was all based off of one phone call. Sure. But after a month's period of time, I'm getting a little edgy. I'm wondering what the heck. So one day I call up there, and I don't get a hold of him. Instead, I get a hold of his mother. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm very polite with people I don't know over the phone, especially. And I was like, "Yes, ma'am. May I please speak with Robert?" And she's like, "Who are you?" And right away, jumping my case. I was like, "I'm a friend of Robert's." "Where are you calling from?" "Oh, well, I'm down in Florida." She said, "Are you one of those computer pirates?" Just like that. Just like that. She screams at me. I was like, "Ma'am, I'm a friend of your son's." "These computer pirates are getting Robert in trouble, and he's only 16 years old. He doesn't need this type of trouble," and blah, 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 screaming at me. And basically, I ended up hanging up the phone, especially after hearing he was only 16 years old. Which impressed the living hell out of me, but just the same, I know I shouldn't be dealing with a 16-year-old. And hung up the phone. son of a bitch never sent me a goddamn thing. But it was just sort of one of those funny moments. And on top of it, like I said before, I always had people hanging around my shop. You know, whether they were customers, the cops, friends, whomever. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't wait to tell them the story because they were all aware of what I was doing, of what had just happened. And most of them, especially at that time, knew who I was talking about in so much as a running game on the computer was Montezuma's Revenge for people to play, and had been for probably 2 months at that point. And, again, it didn't matter. The cops were the good old boy type cops.
Yeah, yeah.
It wasn't like today where they got a stick up their butt, afraid that somebody's going to snitch them out or whatever.
Right.
No, I was a hangout and it was well known. Hell, the chief he didn't hang out, but he frequented my establishment and saw his men hanging around my establishment, many more times than just once. Again, that went on for years and years. What else can I think of? I remember the guy Mike that I speak of down in Lauderdale. In the very beginning, he taught me a lot about the Atari. He had already been into it for a year or whatever. And he turned me on to the earliest form of, internet, if you will, CompuServe. And Mike's big thing at that time was everybody was fascinated. We're communicating over a phone. Although TTYs were available, my wife's parents were deaf, and I knew a little bit about that, but it was still fascinating to hook your phone up to an acoustic modem and, get something out of it. So he'd go into CompuServe, and he'd, watch, again, you're watching, 1,000 people talking back to one another, back and forth with one another, unless they stepped into a side room. They did have side rooms at that time. But basically, you're looking at all the general conversations running up and down, and he'd take note of a few different names, and then all of a sudden he'd type in something ignorant like, your mama's a faggot or whatever, and then he'd address it to certain people that he had noticed that were, constantly flowing by on the screen. And all of a sudden, CompuServe would explode. They'd all be jumping down his throat, and that's exactly what he wanted. He liked getting the attention, and he liked cussing people out for no reason.
He's a troll.
Yeah, but again, trolls didn't exist at that time.
Right.
He might have been the original troll, because I never saw anybody else do that on CompuServe, although I didn't keep CompuServe for very long. But it was just funny the way things started.
Yeah.
Revelations, like I remember the 850 interface, I think used to sell for $200. And then I'm at a loss for the name of the company. I want to say Apex, but I'm not sure. But they came out with the first third-party interface. And, it was like $50, $70, something like that. And it was like, holy mackerel. Sold a ton of those.
Yeah.
The other thing that helped me, again, I got into the happy backup system very early. I wasn't one of those that could break down a program and remove the protection from it and put it back on a disk. I had other friends that could do that. Myself, again, every piece of software that came in, even if I had a mild interest, I would make a backup of it, and that was from happy backup systems. I actually used to sell those as well.
Nice.
Again, to encourage people to back up their own software. Rich Adams, like I say, he was another strange one. Scott was okay, but Rich was. You got the feeling that he always thought you were the cops or the FBI or something. And I guess he had right to be paranoid doing what he was doing. I just don't know the legalities behind it. But he was a little squirrely. But his shit worked much better than anybody else's, for sure. No doubt about it. I'm sitting here almost at a loss. I'd actually prefer if you could lead me in this conversation.
Well, yeah, your business is still in business. Is that right?
Actually, I had closed my first store down, which is where all the computer stuff was going on, about 22 years ago, at a guess. And when I did that, I had a mountain of software still, which, as I mentioned to you previously, I still have a mountain of software. Again, brand new in the packaging.
Yeah.
But my computer efforts disappeared 22 years ago. Hell, whenever I stopped playing with computers, now my son, I got him started on the Atari computers when he was about 6, 7 years old. And he was a fanatic, but he didn't get his first IBM until he was 16, I guess, roughly about 16 years old. My brother, who's a honcho with Intel Corporation, gave him his first, I want to say it was a 486 DX100. And he excelled from there. Today he's a programmer for a place called Huge up in New York, and loving life for what it's worth.
So you said you still have stacks of software. Some of my listeners might be interested in that. Do you have a list of what inventory you still have?
Never made a list. In the last 4 years, I advertised it in the Atari forum location, and what I did was take lots of pictures. And I have not updated those pictures, but sporadically here and there. When I first did it, I got inundated with people who wanted the software.
Sure.
That lasted for about a year, and after that it trickled off up until last year. And much to my surprise, I got 2 phone calls within 3 weeks of each other, and both these guys turned into what were about $4,000 or $5,000 customers each. Yeah, one was from France. Claimed he was buying it for himself, because I actually prefer to sell to the end user, especially as low as the pricing that I'm selling the stuff for, rather than a reseller. I've had multiple resellers contact me, and it's like, no thank you, no thank you. I'm not interested in $2.50 per piece. Goodbye.
Right.
And these guys, again, found me on the Atari forums, and I really didn't care how. But he was the one guy from France. Like I say, he's the one that spent about $5,000. Hell, for every box I sent him, what was 2x2 or whatever, just a normal shipping box, packed full of software, he was paying $250 to $300 a pop for shipping.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I said. I was amazed, especially the first order, when I quoted him how much shipping was going to be, and he didn't bat an eyelash. Turns out I don't know how successful he is, but he ordered from me three or four times, and was putting him on France's version of eBay.
Sure.
After he told me he wasn't going to do that. The guy in Canada, which he wasn't so bad, but he was a little bit more picky. I believe him 100% when he said the stuff he was buying was for himself. But those were 2 surprising sales last year. Every once in a while I get somebody call me, and I find it really difficult to find the time for 2 or 3 pieces of software.
Sure.
But anybody who's doing the bulk sales, I kiss their ass quite literally.
What's your Atari Age username if someone wants to look up your your pictures of what you've got?
I believe it's Atari Man 56.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure I was locked out of Atari Man, but it could be Atari Man. I don't recall.
Okay.
It's been a long time since I've even looked at the forum.
Yeah. Interesting. So tell me about you closed your shop and was just the Atari was.
Well, Atari had already passed away, if you will. However, I had mountains of it, but at the same time, it was about 2 years earlier that a Blockbuster appeared about not even a half mile south of me, about a quarter of a mile south of my store. And I saw the decline in movie rentals. And I was like, the computer thing was still there, but it wasn't like it had used to be. And like I say, my movie rentals went downhill tremendously. So I basically closed up shop for what was 8-9 months, reopened about a mile south of my other shop, and decided to go into the adult industry, put it that way. Virtually, my thinking was, and it proved to be right, I've been doing it for 22 years, and that is, I'll take the business that the blockbusters of the world don't want.
Sure. Yeah.
And it worked out real well. I mean, common saying in business is, don't expect to make money in the first year or two. Better have enough backup cash, whatever, to cover your ass for a year or two. After I opened up this place, along with the fact that I advertised in the local mullet wrapper, as I call it, that Gary's back, and a lot of people knew what that meant. Quite literally, I was making money in my first month.
And that's still what you're doing today?
Yep, for the most part, yep.
Cool.
Again, the Atari deals that come along on the sideways and stuff like that's been enough to, I put one kid through college and the other one, went for a year and then decided to go off to Ireland with my brother. And she met herself a very nice lad over there in Ireland and still lives there.
Nice.
That was 14 years ago. Well, you already met Glenn. Did Glenn mention anything about the other two key players?
No, he just said people sent him the software via modem, and he didn't really say much about who they were, or he said they were not Atari employees as far as he knew, and that's all I got out of him.
That's interesting, because Glenn, upon me speaking with Steve about him again, as far as both of us can remember, his specialty was strictly cracking the cartridges, both 5200 as well as the 800, and putting them on disc. That was his big thing. Again, that's what we used him for.
Yeah.
We could do after a while, we could do the 800 cartridges. However, the fact that he could do the 5200 cartridges made him special.
Sure. Yeah.
But we did have our network, as I mentioned to you earlier, connections in Houston, Texas, the connections there in, what I believe, did Glenn mention, was he from Maryland?
Yes, he's in Maryland.
Okay. I still have a few live brain cells. Like I say, it's been over 22 years since I spoke with him or even more or less thought of him, except to make a joke. I can't remember the guy. We had some guys up in Michigan. Can't remember them because they did contribute, but they were minor contributors. Once in a blue moon, they'd come up with something good. I remember one time, here you go, I just remembered another story. I got to be a friend with a guy who apparently was the largest Atari dealership over in Tampa.
Okay.
Met him over the phone. I don't recall how, if he called me, I called him, whatever it was, I don't recall. And after talking with the guy for probably, what was a half hour, 45 minutes on the phone, he comes out with, hey, the Giants are going to be playing Tampa next week. You guys, you want to come out here? And he already knew about Steve. I think that's how it was, that he got Steve's name off of one of the cartridges when the things used to boot up on disc. And somehow he found me. I honestly don't remember. Anyway, long and the short of it is, he invites us over to Tampa to stay at his place. And again, we have no idea where we're going or who this guy is. But he tells us he's got seats on the 50-yard line to watch the Giants play Tampa. And both Steve and I are New York Giants fans, and we're like, yeah, that's great. We go over there, and when we get over there, this guy lives on the bay. I mean, the waterfront is literally 50 feet in back of his house. Beautiful place, much more than we expected. Multi-million-dollar type place even back then. And Dick at that point was probably about 20 years my senior. I was probably about 35 at the time. And he's like, hey, and he's treating us to everything. He's got the spread out when we get there. The wife is, super nice and everything. And the icing on top of the cake is right before we get to go to the game, he's like, hey, let me show you something they just sent me. What's that? He pulls out the cartridge up and down. I don't know if you remember the game.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so here's a new game on cartridge that we've never seen before and not even heard of. And it's not bad. It's a decent game. So we go to a football game, we all have a good time, whatever, and we go back to Dick's place. And the following morning, right before we leave, I asked Dick, I was like, hey, Dick, do you mind if we just borrow that cartridge overnight and I'll ship it right back to you? And he's like, well, no problem, but make sure, because, it's my only copy or whatever he said. There was something special about it. Like, no problem. And again, I'm a man of my word, especially when it came to the piracy issues. I tell him I'm going to send it back tomorrow, and you can bank on the fact it's going to be sent back to him tomorrow.
Yeah.
So we get back into Fort Pierce here at my store at what was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and Steve, at this point, he knows how to do the normal Atari cartridges, not the 5200 ones, and he breaks the thing and puts his name and my name on it, much similar to what you've seen before. And we sent it out to somebody amongst our group. And here's a new one, never been seen before, have fun, whatever. The following day, he was a friend of mine, and at the same time, though, he was a customer, and he was not part of he was a wannabe in the way of the piracy type stuff. He had his little group, and he had his bulletin board, and a nice enough guy, but he just couldn't bust into being one of us. Well, the following day, probably an hour after I opened up, his name was Mark. He comes walking into the shop. He's like, I got something you guys ain't got. He's very proud of himself.
Yeah.
He won't even tell us what it is. And stick into my machine, and the thing boots up, and there's my name with Steve's. I was like, what do you mean? And before it's even booted up, I'm like, this is up and down. We put it out last night. And he's like, I was telling him, how stupid are you? You can't read, Steve and Gary? And his jaw dropped. He's like, I heard you guys get that. And, well, that's why you're second level, dude. You're lucky to have gotten it. In fact, I think he got it from the guy I've mentioned by the name of Rick out in Houston, because Rick was one of our trusted people. And Rick had posted it when he shouldn't have, or something like that, and was highly apologetic, but, we didn't really care that much. I got another story.
All right.
I may have told you this when we spoke before. The kid in town whose name is identical to mine.
No, I didn't. You didn't tell me the story.
Okay. All right. Back in those days, we used to, and Mike was the one who provided us the knowledge about this. One that was down in Lauderdale. We used to hack phone numbers, so we'd be able to make free phone calls anywhere in the goddamn world, and never see a bill for it. However, if you did it too much, and of course if you gave out the phone number to too many people, it would happen that you would start getting phone calls from different phone companies trying to track down who did what. And I had they were calling me because I was running my bulletin board, but I never had anything on my bulletin board. Only my friends could upload stuff to me that I would want. However, nobody who was on the bulletin board could see that it was there. So the phone companies from all over the country, over long periods of time, were calling me and, who called your phone number at 2 o'clock in the morning? I'm like, sir, I'm running a bulletin board here. I don't have a clue. Well, don't you keep records? No, I don't keep any records. It's a very simple bulletin board. I do it for my customers. I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, needless to say, I knew exactly what they were talking about. Mike was the biggest culprit. And being down in Lauderdale, without exaggeration, over the years, I probably got 25 phone calls regarding him alone. Anyway, so we had these 800 numbers, and we used to do the 800 numbers prolifically. Matter of fact, the one that lasted the longest, which lasted about 3 years, was... we found out about it at the very end, was Westinghouse Corporate. Apparently, they had a 800 number that any of their employees could use. You'd punch in the 800 number, then you'd punch in, I think it was a 5 or 6 digit code, and then you'd get a dial tone to dial anywhere in the world you wanted to. That was the best one. It took them a long time to catch on. Again, we were using it for file transfer, and at that time we're doing maybe, if we're lucky, we had a 1200 baud modem.
Right, right.
The Hayes Smart modem.
Do some long calls.
Right, right. But and I'm going to jump to a different story now, and that is whenever we got Montezuma's Revenge initially. This guy, oh, that's what I was talking about earlier, Little Gary. Like I say, he had my same exact name. Literally, his middle initial was the same as mine. It wasn't the same middle name, and I didn't know this. He was a customer of mine. I knew he had my first name and last name, which I thought was a very strange coincidence. And literally, I brought him from knowing nothing about computers to the point where he got a hell of a lot more technical than I ever thought about being. So anyway, I wake up one morning, and I always get the newspaper at home, and our standard operating procedure is to wake up in the morning, make coffee, go grab the newspaper, come back in, bring the coffee into the bedroom, lay there, read the newspaper. Well, I open up the newspaper to the local section, which is the second section. On the front page of the local section, and I have to paraphrase this, but something to the effect of young Port St. Lucie man busted in phone scam or something to this effect. And I start reading the article, and lo and behold, they got my name in there. And I'm like, holy shit. And the only thing that was working in my favor was the fact that Little Gary, as we called him, was 16 years old, and I was twice his age. That's the only thing going for me. And I was actually shocked. I think he was 17 years old. Either way, it doesn't matter. I was actually shocked that they put his name in the paper being a minor. But they were accusing him of having robbed more than $150,000 worth of phone services.
Wow.
And I don't doubt it, but I would think they probably pumped it up somehow. But either way, it didn't matter. Here's my name in the paper, and at this point, I'm a fairly well-known entity in Fort Pierce. And I come in to work that day, and without I probably took the abuse for the first 10 phone calls. After that, I got to the point where, does it seem to you that I'm 16 years old, asshole? And I'd hang up the phone. Or 15, 17, whatever it was. But yeah, Little Gary got pummeled for that. Well, I got pummeled on his behalf. The kid was so scared of what he had done, because they did arrest him and whatnot, even though he was minor. He ended up running away to Canada for what was 2 years.
Wow. At
17 years old. Hooked up with a pig lady up there that had him under his spell or whatever. It was the first time he got laid. Because 2 years later, when he came back, I was the first one he came to visit. And I was like, Gary, you realize you took a chance coming back into the country, don't you? Especially now. You didn't face the judge, and there's going to be more penalties. And he's like, yeah, I know, but I had to come see Mom and this, that, and the other. And I was like, dude, the best thing you can do is go turn yourself in. And he did. And long and the short of it is, he didn't get. I don't know if he had restitution. I know he did not get jail time, but I also know he wasn't allowed to use a computer for 2 years or something like that.
Wow.
And again, I'm talking way back when they didn't even know how to prosecute stuff like this. I guess because he never saw time, and if the $150,000 was real, somebody wants restitution.
Right.
But that didn't happen. I know that much.
Crazy.
Yeah. After that, I didn't. I don't. Instead of seeing him every other day, I would see him perhaps once every 2 or 3 months. He just, again, he thought he was a close friend of mine, and the fact is, he was half my age, and just I treated everybody well.
Right. Right.
And at least if he had any money. If you're one of those that came in and used to browse for an hour and walk out without buying anything, you might catch some of my verbal abuse. Who else? Oh, that was what I was going to tell you about Montezuma's Revenge. Again, this involves Little Gary. When we first got Montezuma's Revenge, this guy, Little Gary, again, half my age, comes walking in the shop, sees us playing it. And it was a very good game. Personally, I used to love the jumping around, picking things up like Jumpman and whatever, and Montezuma's fell into this category. So we're sitting there playing the game. He walks in. He's like, "Oh, what's that? What's that? Oh, looks good. Can I have one? Can I have one?" I was like, "Gary, I'll give you a copy of it." I was like, "But you got to promise me it goes to nobody else."
Mm-hmm.
And I do mean nobody. And he accepted those conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, Steve was at the shop when this happened. Next day, the other guy, Mark, who I mentioned earlier, having me up and down, comes into my shop. He's like, again, he's doing the same thing. "I got one you guys don't have," and this type of thing. Pop it in. It's Montezuma's Revenge.
Mm-hmm.
And right away, because he knew little Gary, I was like, "Where'd you get that from?" And little Gary was part of his little group.
Uh-huh.
I was like, "Where'd you get that from?" And we used to call this guy Wimpy. He used to work in the fast food places, various places.
Mm-hmm.
And so we nicknamed him Wimpy. I was like, "Wimpy, where the hell did you get that?" And right away, he succumbed. He was like, "Little Gary gave it to me." I "Really?" "Okay." And we didn't tell Wimpy what was going on. He just left, understanding that once again he was late on the bandwagon. And Steve calls up little Gary. And right away, Steve jumps on. And again, Steve. So although Steve's younger than me, he's probably 15 years older than little Gary, if not a little more. And he jumps on little Gary's shit about having given away Montezuma. "What did we tell you? That was for you, for nobody else."
Right.
And I wasn't on the phone. I was just in the background laughing and whatnot. And he's like, "Tell you what we're going to do." He goes, "I want you to put your disc collection in one big box. And it better be everything." He goes, "And I'm going to be by your house in 15 minutes to pick up that box." Right? And he hangs up the phone. And I turn to Steve, "What the hell are you going to do?" He goes, I'm going to take his software." He goes, I'll give it back to him." He goes, "But, I want to put the fear of God into him." "Okay, whatever." So Steve takes off, comes back 15 minutes later, whatever, and sure enough, he's carrying a big box of software. I mean, again, I'm talking about a 2x2 box that's got 2 levels of discs in it.
Mm-hmm.
Just, a good-sized collection. And I also mentioned my 13-inch color TV that I opened up with, the first monitor that I had hooked up to my Atari system. Well, I still had that TV. It was serving a different function because at this point I've now got a Commodore, 1020, 1040, whatever it was.
Yeah.
I got that hooked up and it looks much better. But Steve comes walking into the shop. He's like, and he starts not screaming, but he's agitated. He's like, "That little son of a bitch. You're supposed to, put all of them in one box, and I had to make sure. I went into his house and looked, and there were more discs there, and I made him give me those." And he's pissed at the guy, this little Gary guy. He starts pulling discs out of the box,
Mm-hmm.
and he starts tossing them at my 13-inch color GE TV is what it was. And when he would toss them, they would stick to the screen. The thing had a magnetic field on it. I think I'm probably going to die at an early age because of it.
Yeah.
And quite literally, he turned it into a tossing event as to how many he could toss onto the screen and without them falling. It probably went through about 25, 30 discs, and they're just laying on the floor, the ones that have fallen or didn't make it, whatever. And I finally had to put a stop to it. I was like, "Steve, come on, don't do that." But even though I'm laughing hysterically, I was like, come on, don't do that. We ended up giving him the discs back the next day or something like that. But it was just one of those funny, quirky things that happened. All the piracy, though, I can't say all of it. Some of it was done through the mail, but the majority of it was downloads.
Mm-hmm.
ATA and ATD.
Yeah.
Do you remember those commands?
Yeah. Well, ATDT phone number.
Right,
Yep.
right.
ATH to hang up. Yep.
Right. And used to use those quite prolifically.
Yeah.
Hold on just a moment. I have a customer I got to deal with.
All right.
Hold on. How you doing?
How you doing?
Another wonderful thing in the shithole, but thank you for reminding me. You know that.
Nothing changes, huh?
No, not even my underwear, but that's more than you need to know.
Well, that.
Right. $12.85 is your damage, sir. A small price to pay for a fine education, I might add. Out of a $13 bill. Like Dad would have told you, don't spend that all in one place. And study hard, young man. You want to pass this course, got to do your homework.
All right.
Have a good. I'm back.
Okay.
You like the way I do business?
I do. I like that a lot. That's
Been
staying
that way for 22 years.
Nice.
When you're in the adult business, you don't have to be formal.
Right, yeah.
The moment they walk in through my portals, they are sleaze bags.
Was he buying a video?
3 of them, to be exact.
Yeah.
Adult.
Yeah. I see.
I do still have, due to local ordinances, I have to have a certain amount of, they're actually VHS tapes, otherwise they'd have to be DVDs, that I keep in the front third of the store. When you come into my store, the front third of it, you can't tell that I have anything adult. You have to go further back.
So it's just like old copies of Pretty Woman and this stuff on VHS?
Exactly. How'd you know I had that? I think I got 2 copies of it.
I don't know. I've never been in your store. How would I know that? I don't know.
Right. I think you got ESP. Let's see. What else can I try to remember? Like I say, my stories are always spurred on by people that witnessed whatever happened and remind me of the story.
Well, you told me something about when I was trying to find Glenn. You said something about you sent him some cartridges and then they didn't come back and you had to.
Right. Eventually they did, but I had to get a hold of him and kind of it took him what was supposed to be, I don't know, a 3 to 5 day thing back and forth, turned into what was 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And again, I base it on the fact that he was afraid to leave his house. He just, like I say, he was a very strange bird. But he did what he said he was going to do. And in this case, the 5 cartridges that I had sent him were all 5,200 cartridges. And he was the only one that could do them. I buy the things normally, through my distributors, whatever, to resell. And I might buy 6 of an item. Yeah. One of them would get shipped off to Glenn. Matter of fact, I got so good at it, in as much as opening the boxes, I didn't want to tear the boxes open because all of a sudden it goes from being brand new to being used. So I figured out a way to get the boxes open without tearing them. And quite simply, Atari used to use, or whoever packaged them for them, used to use heat glue. And I had a heat gun for shrink wrapping stuff. And I learned very quickly, just apply heat, the thing will pop open, do whatever you want with the cartridge, and whenever you go to put it back, again, just seal it up, apply heat, it's brand new still.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, the stories and misinformation about Glenn are epic. I mentioned yesterday I was at a computer club meeting, and I mentioned that I interviewed Glenn, and the response was, "Oh, he was an Atari employee who was so mad at Atari." I'm like, "No, I don't think so. That's not it." And then I got an email from someone else today saying who didn't know that I had done the interview, and he said, "I heard you're looking for Glenn. Glenn's name is David so and so. I met him years ago." I was like, "No, it's not."
Jesus, again, did you? Oh no, you've already done your interview with Glenn.
Yeah.
I would wonder if he'd take interest in hearing stuff like this, that his name is still being passed around and nobody knows what they're talking about.
I told him he was a legend back in the day. He's like, "Yeah, I know, but I wasn't not interested in,
He was a quiet legend.
Yeah.
And what else can I think of?
Do you still have a Atari 800 or any Atari 800?
Oh gosh, I probably have about. Again, they've been stored away for 20 years plus, but I've probably got about 3 800s. I probably have about 4 or 5 XLs. Hell, I've got 4 or 5 STs. Can't give them away. Literally. I've never really tried, but just looking at eBay and seeing what people are trying to get out of them, I've seen entire setups with the monitor and everything, and people asking $50 and they can't sell it.
Yeah.
So I don't even worry about that. One unique thing that I do have, which again I still cannot sell. Did you ever hear about the ICD host adapter hooked up with the SideQuest hard drive?
No, I don't really know what.
Oh, okay.
I know some of those words, but I don't know how they're connected.
Okay, SideQuest was a removable hard drive.
44 or 88 megabytes, as I recall.
Correct. and using the ICD host adapter would make it recognizable through the ST. And to this day, I've got one disk that isn't even near filled up, but I'd venture to say easily has over $6,000 worth of software on it, back measured by the old prices. I've got a blank disk that was never opened. I bought a second blank disk, if I remember, for about $35, $45, which I never even used. Didn't realize how much space the thing had. If you remember, the first Atari hard drives were 20 meg.
Yeah.
And these things were 44 meg, and like, my goodness. And the prices in buying the host adapter as well as the SideQuest hard drive were lesser than buying the Atari hard drive by itself. Although I only sold 2 setups.
You might sell another one after people hear this. I don't know.
Again, that thing hasn't been plugged in 22 years.
Yeah.
Once I got out of the computer business, because I was so sickened by the fact that Atari started going mass merchant. I mean, they literally ran me out of business. And then, I was so angry at Jack Tramiel, if I ever had him face to face, I would have spit in his face. I think I mentioned the fact that, to become an Atari dealer, they wanted you to kick $5,000 their way, for which you got a couple of bags of parts.
Yeah.
And the right to buy it from Atari. And I watched how 3-4 months after he made this promise, the shit started appearing in mass merchants. And I was like, you piece of shit. You piece of shit. I was so angry about that. But yeah, when I got out of the Atari business, quite literally, I shut myself off from computers for 6-7 years until my son started picking up on the IBM stuff. And then my son, he became quite fluid with the computer, where I spent the whole time ignoring it. I just didn't have the stomach to dick with computers anymore. And what actually brought me back into computers was, again, piracy. and that being specifically, it started out with DirecTV, reprogramming DirecTV cards, which, again, was a very, very fruitful enterprise for me. Later on down the road, I met a guy who was doing Dish Network, and we more or less teamed up. And he was doing Dish Network on a much bigger volume than I ever thought about doing. I remember when I first met him, I helped him acquire what was 250 Dish Network receivers from a local store here in town. And as soon as he got them, he loaded up. He had one of those dual wheelie trucks. And the guy was from Chicago. And he literally bought those 250, and I think I turned him on to about 50 other ones. So he probably left Fort Pierce with about 300 of these satellite receivers and drove them up to Chicago. And when he came back, he told me that he profited off that by something like $40,000, because you couldn't outright buy just the receivers, theoretically.
Right.
Just by the people that I knew. And I didn't have a clue. I mean, I knew what he was doing, but I couldn't imagine what he was going to do with 250 from one place, 250 Dish Network satellite receivers, no less the other 50 that I acquired for him. And literally, he would drive them up to Chicago and sell them off at an unbelievable margin. And that was the next field of piracy of some nature that I was into. That lasted about 5-6 years.
Nice. All right. I think I should wrap this up. Any final thoughts any message you want to send to the Atari community that still exists?
Only that it was a pleasure serving the customers that I had for all those years. My store was open for what was 11 and a half years. Had a lot of fun. I have no regrets, none whatsoever. And I made a lot of friends along the way, both from customers as well as people that were in the field, whether they were software programmers or manufacturers, whomever. I mean, I made friends across the board. And there's not one person out there that can say a bad thing about me in regards to Atari. I'm glad I clarified that. But no, it was a nice ride up until Tramiel bought the place.
Yeah.
Like I say, that still sticks in my craw.
Yeah.
There was so much more that could have been done with Atari. And like I say, as far as I'm concerned, all he did was bankrupt the place and make these kids rich.
Yeah.
That's what he did. So whenever he passed, I did not shed a tear. He was a goneth from the word go. If you know what that means.
I do not, but...
Okay, it's a Yiddish term.
Mm-hmm.
No, I look forward only, Kevin, to seeing my podcast and what you make of it.
I will.
That I do look forward to, and being able to turn on certain people to it. I'm sure it'll put a smile on some people's faces as they remember the good old days.
Excellent. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I'm certain once I turn these other people onto it, they're going to turn around and, why didn't you tell them the story? Like, dude, I've forgotten more than I remember. What do you want?
Your dirty pirate friends are welcome to contact me, and I will interview them too.
There's one, the guy that I term as Mike, the Jolly Roger, whom he still lives down in Lauderdale, and I'm not in contact with him but maybe 2 to 3 times a year. If I can get Mike to talk to you, and I don't doubt that he would talk to you, whereas Steve, I'm 90% sure he's not going to talk to you. But Mike may very well. Kevin, been a pleasure speaking with you.
It's been a pleasure, Gary. Thank you very much.
You have a good one. If ever I can help you with anything else, please feel free to call.
All right. Thank you so much. If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.